Hello, my name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute in Budapest. And normally, of course, I would be addressing you in a hall where we'd be holding a conference or a lecture or a seminar. Now, we can't do those things because we're all locked in Budapest, including presumably you. And that applies, I think, to most of the countries where people are likely to see this podcast. So on behalf of you all, welcome. And I'm happy today to say that our guest is Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray is an old friend of the Danube Institute. He's been a speaker here on 2 or 3 occasions. He is, and he's been described, I think, reasonably as the most important public intellectual today writing and speaking in the British Isles. Douglas may consider that a mixed compliment, being a conservative, but nonetheless, it's a deserved one, I think. And it emerges from the fact that his writings in books, in articles, and his performance in debates have established him as a formidable critic on all of the major issues of the day and a formidable opponent of, I would say, the irrationalist left on those issues. Now, so Douglas, welcome.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, John, and to be with all your viewers.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to begin by going through some of the books that you've written to establish the kind of background you have and the kind of topics you've addressed. The first book, of course, you wrote before you even went to university. It was a biography of Lord Alfred Douglas, the lover of Oscar Wilde. And I'm fascinated how you were able to write and get published a book in such an early age when you were in the 6th form.
Well, you know, John, there aren't very many advantages to getting older, but one of them is at least no longer being called a wunderkind or all those sorts of unpleasant labels you get if you're too ostentatious early on. And yes, I published my first book when I was 20. I wrote it when I was 18, I suppose. I finished it the week before going up to Oxford, and it came out in my 2nd year. It's always very hard to say what drives you to a particular subject. In that case, it was partly that there was an issue of what I regarded as being a sort of hidden history. That's something I may come back to that's sort of run throughout quite a lot of my work, is things you're not meant to look into or nobody has looked into, which therefore drive me to look into them. In this particular case, I thought there was a hidden story, an untold story about this figure, Alfred Douglas, who was a minor figure in literary history, but a sort of a very major figure in one of the biggest scandals of the latter part of the 19th century in the UK. So I was fortunate enough to have met a number of the last people who knew him, and then decided, rather ostentatiously perhaps, that I should write his biography. And yes, that was my first venture into the literary world. And then, of course, I discovered that I was a writer, which nobody could refute, and which covers all sorts of sins.
Well, that's a very good start. And of course, then you went on to do something that's perhaps more controversial even, and that is that you wrote your next book on neoconservatism. And you wrote that book really introducing neoconservatism as a coming idea in UK politics. Would you still hold to those views?
It's my only book which I have refused requests to do new editions of, because I think there'd be too much rewriting. I stick to most of the points I make in the book, certainly the history, the intellectual history parts of it, which I'm proud of. It was a very difficult thing to sum up some of the thinking that I thought was being badly misrepresented in the public sphere in those times, in the early and mid-2000s. The term neocon was very ugly then. I think now it's past all saving, certainly for a long time to come. And I could already see that was the case when I was writing. But now, I mean, to say neocon or neoconservative is to immediately have to spend the rest of your time hacking through thickets of intellectual fog and misunderstanding. So I don't use the term. I think there are all sorts of things I say that I'm proud of in that book, and which I think made some difference. But there are also bits of that which I think, one thing in particular, which I think I made a great error on, and something I'm sure I'll come back to at some point.
Well, as a matter of fact, I read the book and I remember hosting a discussion with you about it in Washington, and I thought it was a good book and very interesting. But it marked you, it particularly was interesting because it marked you out as someone who was swimming against the tide, since the tide against neoconservatism was already there, I think. And that's true of your next book, I think, too, which is your book into the Saville Inquiry into the events of Bloody Sunday, when the paratroop regiment shot, I think you will know, 13 people in Derry back in the 70s. And now that it struck me was an absolutely brilliant book. It was a forensic examination of the evidence given to the Saville Inquiry, lasting over something like I think several years and many millions of pounds. And at the end of it, I think you came up with a great deal of information that would change any fair-minded person's view of what happened that day and who was responsible for it. The responsibility was mixed. But that book, there was an intellectual tour de force in many ways, was a commercial failure. And I wonder if I could ask you to explore the reasons for that, because it's an important event.
That's a very interesting point. I'm very proud of that book, of Bloody Sunday. It was an enormous amount of work. I have still a shed filled with all of the files of all the testimony that I had to go through for that book, as well as attending hearings. Yes, the inquiry in question was the longest and costliest inquiry in British legal history. Even went past the Warren Hastings impeachment. It relates to one of the ugliest days in the very ugly history of the conflict in Northern Ireland. I became interested in it for lots of reasons. But the main one was that I started to realize that here was a fascinating window into one of the great questions, the question of truth. And in particular, why it is that different human beings throughout the course of their own lives change their own memories of things, how memory becomes a sort of palimpsest of which different layers appear. Also, how different people with equally good intentions completely misremember things, have contradictory memories of things, and what is right in these situations. This was a legal process looking into something that happened by then 30 to 40 years earlier, and 40 years by the time the report came out. And I became fascinated by this question of how do we get to the nature of truth, particularly after such a long space of time. It was really an inquiry into the nature of truth, and a number of critics, I was very pleased, noticed that. As for that, yes, you're right. It was a critical success and a commercial non-success. Nobody ever became rich from my book on Bloody Sunday, least of all me. But I think there are various reasons for that. One is perhaps for international audience, it's too much set in a very specific place. I think a more obvious reason, I think, is that certainly when that book came out in 2011, 12, something like that, my experience was that people in Britain in particular just didn't want to hear anything else about the conflict in Northern Ireland. As you well know, John, for decades it had just been there as this horrible, squalid, bloody, messy conflict, and that seemed to have no end in sight. And there was finally a cessation in 1998 of the conflict itself. And my own view is that after that, most people just wanted to forget about it. And I'd add just one other thing quickly, which is I think that there is sometimes it might be said that there is little appetite for looking into the errors of your own side. And Bloody Sunday was perhaps the biggest military error by the British in that conflict. And so a lot of perhaps natural readers of mine just don't want to know about that.
It was the biggest military error, and I think the biggest moral error in the conflict. Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that when you were writing and publishing the book, the people who read it on the British side all essentially acknowledged the horror of what had been done by the pirates. No one was defending what was done. It was a question of allocating blame between A and B. Yeah. What was interesting, though, was the decision or the desire not to look into what seemed to be evidence of what the IRA had done wrong on that occasion, and particularly Martin McGuinness. And I think it's really interesting that we didn't want to look into that either, even though the IRA persistently, the Provisionals and Sinn Féin, they persistently demand more inquiries while resisting of British behaviour, of official behaviour, while resisting any inquiries into their own. That I think is significant.
Yes. There's a very good reason for that, of course, which is they simply want to win. And they believe that having lots of inquiries into missteps and worse by the British Army is desirable, but of course they wouldn't want any inquiry into the many killings that the Provisional IRA carried out, which are still where the killers are still alive, are perfectly free, and have never really had their lives bothered at all for carrying out mass murder. I'd add just one other thing on that, which is that I was very proud of the fact that when that book came out, it was just before coming out, actually. I sent it to the then Northern Ireland Secretary, who read it overnight and said to me after reading it, after reading this book, I just think no more inquiries. No more inquiries. And that was very interesting. It wasn't my intent particularly, but it was certainly my intent to show the complexity of trying to get to truth after such a long time. And because of, as I say, because of, among other things, the failings of human memory, which are, as I show in the book, absolutely extraordinary.
Yes, you have an extraordinary story about a missing eyelash and the different accounts of how it got there after a bomb went off. I want to turn to your next book, which was The Strange Death of Europe through Immigration and Multiculturalism, essentially. I think your most successful book to date in commercial terms, and one that's been republished everywhere. My question here is that you wrote that book about 10 years after a book by Christopher Caldwell, the American journalist, and he had asked in his book the question, can Europe be the same with different people in it? And your reply to that question, it seemed to me, was no, it can't. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes, I think that's right. I much admired Christopher Caldwell's book, as I do all of his writing. And I thought it was a very brave book he wrote, particularly at the time he wrote it. Yes, I thought that the answer to that question was pregnant within it. And I simply took it to the next stage, really, of showing why I thought on a whole range of issues it was unwise to think of immigration, migration, mass migration, in as frivolous and simplistic a manner as we were thinking it. It had always struck me that one of the interesting things about migration is that we recognize its enormous significance in history, and yet we pretend that it has little significance in the current day, so that we still talk in Britain about the Huguenot migration of 4 centuries ago, but we pretend that migration of today will not have any particularly meaningful effect, or that the only effect will be positive. And I don't say that by any means that migration is only a positive or a negative force. I say it's clearly got elements of both and much more. But what struck me was that people had not been looking at the question in the round. And I found, as you know, that when I've been writing about multiculturalism, about mass migration and more for a long time. But in 2015, when the migration crisis from North Africa and the Middle East began, and I started to go to the places where people were arriving and to speak to people and to see this, I realized that somebody, and then I realized that it had to be me, or at least that I would do it, had to sum up or try to sum up the entirety of this story. Not just what was happening in terms of arrivals, but the full story of what it means for a continent like Europe to decide on a policy like this. And then also, why would that have come about? After all, it's quite an unusual situation in historical terms for a society to indeed even clamp down on people who are critics or raise concerns, even very legitimate concerns, often concerns that are even borne out in our own lifetimes, proven to be right in our own lifetimes. It's unusual for a society to be so eager to stop a debate about its own future, or to limit a debate about its own future. So I tried in The Strange Death of Europe to do this thing in its entirety. And I'm delighted by the international response to it. It's come out in 20 or 30 languages now, and it's been a wonderful thing to have so many members of the public reading it, so many politicians reading it, and my own view is that the issues that it raises, they dampen down like all big issues. There are moments when they are issue number one, and times when you're somewhere further down that pecking order. But this issue will not be going away, and it is very likely in the coming years to be coming back, perhaps stronger as an issue. So I'm pleased to have tried to have done some of the thinking on it as well as the reporting on it at this stage.
Let me ask you then, narrow the focus here a bit and ask the question about Britain, your own country. And if Britain cannot be the same with different people in it, maybe it will be better in some respects, worse in others, as you suggest. What will Britain look like? How will it be different in the future?
I'm very wary of predictions, because my own discovery in my own life so far is that there's a whole heap of things you just never see coming. And however, there are certain things, certain directions of travel, shall we say, which you can see. It is possible that a country like Britain, even with its extremely diverse population, could become a sort of, or remain, if you like, a sort of harmonious society that's very pluralistic. However, in order for that to happen, you have to have massive projects. We might come on to this. It might be something we're going through at the moment. But it's my view that a highly diverse and pluralistic society, among other things, finds it extremely hard to draw on a sort of collective pronoun, should we say. Our late friend Roger Scruton used to talk about this, the significance of the plural, of the first person, of the we in a society. To draw on that, to be able to say we as a country, as a society, have a certain view on something, it just simply becomes incredibly difficult if you're trying to encapsulate the opinions and indeed peoples of basically the entire world. I don't say it cannot be done. I simply think it's a very hard project to pull off, and it should be acknowledged, was not the intent. We got into the situations that we're in through people not looking to the future, looking very short term at what is one of the longest term issues imaginable. We talk about, as I say, the great sweeps of people in history. This is one such thing, and I think that certain directions, yes, you can see.
Actually, obviously, societies change because of immigration, but they also change without immigration, or are change from internal forces. And in a way, that's the subject of your next book, isn't it? The one that's out at the moment, The Madness of Crowds, which I think is getting a lot of attention. How many languages has it been translated into, or so far?
It's more than a dozen so far. I can't remember. I haven't kept count, but I know that the Spanish translation just came out last week.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
yes.
Well, I was going to say that it covers all of the questions emerging from identity politics. It looks at the situation of gays, of women, of transsexuals, of racial minorities, and what seems sometimes to be the ever-increasing number of identity groups in our new world. What would you say is the fundamental argument that you're making about all of these different aspects of identity politics in the book?
Well, you're right. I mean, in some ways, The Madness of Crowds comes out of The Strange Death of Europe and says, well, this is something we're doing to ourselves. And it, of course, comes from the same vacuum that I describe in two of the chapters in particular in The Strange Death of Europe, which is this question of what you do to fill the void. And identity politics is one answer to that. I happen to think it's a terrible answer to it, but it is an answer to it. It is to say we will find meaning in our lives by pursuing social justice causes on behalf of minority groups, and indeed of warring on a perceived mainstream, which is actually incredibly dated apart from anything else, to war on the establishment, the patriarchy, the heteronormative society, and all of this sort of thing. So yes, it's been enormous interest to me in the last decade in particular to notice the emergence from the deepest, furthest fringes of academia, a few West Coast American universities, of the spreading of some ideas from these places into the mainstream of political discussion in countries like my own, in countries like Britain, not to mention in America. And of course, all of this is in some ways a reaction to the loss of the we of the nation state. It is to say, well, we recognize people need identities. You will find meaning and you'll find pride in your sexual orientation or your sex or your race or your there are a few other things you could add to that. But to say these are the ways in which you understand society, and this is the way we will understand and explain society, and fight, always fighting to go forward to some great upland. And I just thought, among other things, that somebody needed to expose the full futility of the exercise and the extraordinary contradictory nature of it. I had been for years fascinated by this very ugly term, intersectionality, which came from the American Academy, which makes a set of claims which, as I show in The Manners of Crowds, are totally untrue and self-contradictory. And what I urge, in particular young people, to do is to not waste any of their lives on this. And part of the point of The Madness of Crowds is to say this ideology of, you might call it wokeness, or intersectionality, progressive identity politics, doesn't work. It's highly divisive. It divides men from women. It divides gay people from straight people. It divides white people from everybody else, because the white people are said to be responsible for all the ills of the world. And it encourages grudges. It actually furthers division rather than healing it, which I think is part of the point, incidentally. And so I want just particularly young people not to fall into this very retributive, ugly form of living, and to realize that their lives should really be spent on almost anything else other than this.
Of course, you were accused by the Guardian reviewer of having decided that there should be, that you were arguing rather, that we reached the end of injustice, and that all these new protests and identity groups emerging were illegitimate because really there was nothing much to complain about. I don't myself buy that argument, but it's an interesting response.
It's it's a relatively fair argument from the Guardian against me. Most of the Guardian's arguments against me are deeply unfair, but yes, this particular one is interesting. I don't actually by any means say that we are in the perfect or perfectly fair state. It seems very obvious to me that life is in all sorts of ways unequal and unfair, in some ways that you could address, and in some ways, many ways, you just can't. I mean, there are several inequalities that nobody is interested in. Why? Because there's just nothing you can do about them. For instance, height is an inequality. It's a very important inequality, actually. There are certain jobs you can't do if you're too short. Certain lives you cannot lead. I mean, neither you nor I, John, for instance, will ever be able to master basketball at its absolute zenith, and never could have done. There are all sorts of things that are unequal. That's one, but you can't do anything about it, so we ignore it. Another one, by the way, is attractiveness. There's nothing that you can do about attractiveness, but attractiveness is an enormous advantage in somebody's life. So one of the things I say is, why have we focused on these specific ones of race, sex, and sexuality? And I say it very clearly in The Madness of Crowds, I don't say that by any means we're living in the perfect state, But I do think there is something very strange that needs to be called out because it's so sinister. Where the most free and equal states in the world, the most tolerant, the least racist, the least anti-women, the ones which have most opportunities for people of sexual minorities, should consistently be portrayed as, and portray themselves as, the world's most repressive places. I think there's a perversity to this which consistently needs to be called out.
You know, I don't want to encourage complacency about injustice, but Arthur Balfour, I think, did make a fair point when he said the trouble with justice is there's not enough to go round. Right. Now, I want to turn to a very specific application of this argument. In the world in which you actually live, some Muslim parents in a school in Birmingham protested strongly against the sex education classes that their children were going to be taught. And those classes were radically at variance with obviously what pious Muslims think should be modesty and the proper sexual life that children should lead. Those views, by the way, are roughly coterminous with what many conventional Christians think. And of course there are people who have no religion who would look at the evidence of social science and say that by and large the arguments from gender theory and other things are, you know, go against what we know about what is the best way to bring children up in secure families and so on. How would you deal as a practical matter, if you were in government, with that kind of a problem?
It's a very interesting one, that one, the Birmingham schools issue. It got relatively wide coverage and very little thought. The problem is this is two competing rights claims, basically. The rights claims of a certain section of fairly recent immigrants, in this case, you say, of Muslims, but it could have been of devout Catholics or others, but certainly the sort of fervour of this, it was all on the side of Muslim parents. And it's their claim against the rights claims of some LGBT people. Now, this is very interesting. My own view is that there is something wrong with some of the programs that are taught in schools. And there's in particular something wrong about this issue of attempting to, well, let me put it this way. Teaching tolerance of difference seems to me to be a desirable endeavor, particularly among young people who, I mean, after all, children are famously cruel and need to be civilized in certain ways into understanding that not everyone is going to be like them. That seems to me relatively fine. But if in order to pursue that as a desirable goal, you decide to lie about other things, including biology, for instance, well, that in that case leads you into very undesirable territory indeed. And that's where some of the programs are. You see, I've made this point, I think, once before in print, which is that the trans rights movement learned an awful lot from the gay rights movement. And the gay rights movement, among other things, was accepted because it said, you don't have to change anything in your life. You simply have to allow those of us who are gay to be able to get on with our lives and pursue happiness in the way that we see. Now, the trans movement, of course, does not do that. The trans movement says, we would like to live our lives in the way we see. And that means that you will have to alter some very big things in your own, not necessarily life, but in your understanding of the world. If the gay rights movement had said, gay people exist and that's why there's no such thing as sex, people would have said, but that's impossible to agree with. There are men and women. There might be some men who are same-sex attracted, some women who are same-sex attracted, but there are men and women. The trans movement really has overreached in this, and it's unfortunately, I think, its very poor arguments have polluted the whole alphabet people, as Dave Chappelle, the comedian, calls them, the LGBT community. I loathe the word community because it isn't really a community, it's just people. But yes, the overreach by the T bit of that clearly is having very negative effects and going to cause some blowback. And I don't like the protests at Birmingham schools, but I do understand why parents of all sorts of denominations, all beliefs and none, do get, and I hear from them a lot, do get very, very nervous about what their children are being told. I mean, if you tell a boy that a boy is as able to have a period as a girl is, you are going to disturb that child pretty seriously. And there's one other thing I would add to that, which is, I have this sort of, I don't know where it comes from, but an instinctive desire to not see truth get polluted. And I think there is a terrible cost to pay in a society which agrees that in order to pursue one thing that might be desirable, for instance, as I say, being understanding of other people or tolerant of other people, that in order to do that, you should permit lies, that's where it goes wrong.
Yes, and also, of course, the cutting edge of this issue is going to be those children who have accepted advice and indeed been encouraged sometimes by doctors and social workers to believe that they are of a different gender to their sex, to undertake quite serious surgical or drug and therapy medical treatments, which then they change their minds at 5 or 6 years later. I think the law is going to get involved here.
Yeah, it's fascinating writing about these issues because they can move so fast. And one of the things that I did predict in The Madness of Crowds is already coming true, and that is, I say it in the final chapter on the trans issue, which I think the deepest dive you can into what is going on in the trans issue, and a sympathetic, attempt to look into it. I'm not just flame throwing or something. And I do say there that and this is partly because of interviewing a lot of people who've been through this. I do say there that I expect in the coming years for there to be a growth in legal cases by people who had been misled by medical authorities, and that has actually already started since The Madness of Crowds came out in hardback last September. There's just been a go-ahead just last month in the UK for a young person to take the Tavistock Clinic, which is the foremost clinic in this area in the UK, to court for this, who says, it all happened very quickly. I wasn't really given good guidance, and I didn't want this to happen, actually. I said that would happen. It is happening. And I think, as you say, it will be it is the hard stop, actually, for this. And I think will cause us to think more deeply about this. And that's all I want people to do. I think it's actually a very complex one in certain ways. Not as complex as we're making it, but not as simple as we pretend either. And when you hear ministers, as we have had in the UK, including a Conservative minister, but in particular at the moment, ministers in the opposition, shadow ministers, saying, it's straightforward, trans people are trans and so on. It's just not the case. It's not true. It's dishonest, it's disingenuous, it's misleading. And I want us, as I say, to not mainstream lies.
Yes, I think what you're saying is true. And I think, incidentally, in the magazine National Review, which I used to edit, Madeleine Carnes has written very well about exactly these trends in the United States. And she basically is reporting what you've just been saying and describing the way in which the world of the law is now going to get seriously involved in this. I'd like to change...
She's a very impressive figure. I'm very impressed by Madeleine Carnes' work.
Yes, she's very, very sharp indeed. I'd like to change the focus slightly. We've been discussing your books, we've been discussing the way in which the world has been changing in significant and important ways. But it does appear, I think, to a lot of people, it's been changing in ways they don't like. And other people, generally speaking, people in what you might call the establishments of different countries, favour these changes and want to protect them. So going to high politics, the establishment view of that would be that there's a battle going on between, on the one hand, liberal democracy, and on the other hand, particularly in Europe and Brexit and Trump, authoritarian populism. That's one of the boo terms. Now, there's a big clash brewing, and I'd like to get your analysis here of that way of describing the debate: liberal democracy, authoritarian populism. How true or false?
Yes. I'm very opposed to the use of the term populist, because I think it's populism. I think it's lost all meaning. Long-term readers will know my critiques of this. I think populism long ago became just a synonym for things we don't like, and indeed for popular, just parties that win elections. However, there is something in this divide you describe. I would say it's come about because of an overreach by a certain type of liberal in the last few decades. I'd say that it has a very clear, I mean, I've been a critic of the EU, although now that Britain has left, I feel in some ways it's slightly more rude than it used to be, because it's sort of not my fight anymore. But it has obviously been epitomized, I think, in the EU, of the presumption that the future must be one in which states are watered down and offer up ever more sovereignty, the presumption that the future is more and more borderless, the presumption that a whole set of things. And yes, I think that liberal project, I'm also not keen on the use of the term liberal in this context, because I don't think it is liberal. I think it's a strand of liberalism. But that this strand of liberalism overreach seems to me very clear. And there is obviously a reaction to it. Now, the problem is, of course, is that any and all reaction to it is immediately lumped into the same bucket. There's a very interesting example of this, by the way, that Donald Trump and Boris Johnson are very, very different figures. Whatever one's views or support or criticism of either, they are exceptionally different figures. But if you were to read many of the papers, including some of the leading American papers like the Washington Post and the New York Times, you would be under the presumption that Boris Johnson is precisely the same person as Donald Trump. And the analysis goes very little deeper than the fact that they're both men with light-coloured hair. So the analysis of this reaction is I mean, it is startling how simplistic it is. It is there is a reaction. It's very diverse, but what it has in common is something like a call to slow down, if not stop or reverse, the overreach of recent decades. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to ask. Will it itself have the risk of overreach in certain places? Yes, I'd have thought so, and we should remain alive to it. But we're least likely of all to remain alive to that if we pretend that the whole thing is one great big lump.
Yes, well, let's therefore break it up into several compartments here. How do you, for example, feel about the way in which the coronavirus is being discussed? It seems to me that as it goes on, the epidemic spreads and it becomes more and more part of our politics. There's a debate between people who think the experts should be allowed to run things. That's the traditional progressive view. And a kind of rebellion among others who say, hang on, it's more than about a doctor's view of how an epidemic spreads. It's also about a range of other issues. And therefore, we can't decide those things unless we somehow submit them to democratic opinion as well. And there's a bit of a rebellion now going on in the United States.
Yes, there is. I mean, I think there's something very, very interesting. There's a lot of interesting things going on in this crisis, but one is this. I wrote about this in the Spectator last week, that compare Britain and America in this. Now, our response actually isn't that different. In fact, the responses of most of the democracies is pretty similar. There are some outriders, as we know, like Sweden, and we'll see what happens. But pretty much we've gone down the same path, followed the same advice. It's very striking to me. Britain in recent years has been described as a divided society more often than we could count. We've been said to have been divided, to not believe in authority figures, to have no common story, to indeed to disdain experts has been one of the claims that the British people about the British people in recent years. And I just think that it should be noted that in recent weeks, Boris Johnson, who we're forever being told was this highly divisive politician and so on, told the country what the situation was, warned about the possibility that our NHS was going to be overwhelmed, brought our leading scientists in to persuade the public, and the public were persuaded, and we've done to date what they asked. I mean, there have been a few people who've been idiots and so on, but it's tiny numbers. So it's a very striking thing to me. Here we are, and here I am in this nation that was said to, nothing we did, nothing we believed in. All institutions had been shown to be, ineffectual, and we didn't believe in them anymore. But actually, we have been storing up significant amounts of public trust, even whilst we pretended otherwise. And I think I can say we're delighted when Her Majesty the Queen addressed the nation as the figure most able to unite and give confidence and strength to the nation. So this is a very, very striking thing to me, that it turns out that Parliament, the Prime Minister, leading scientists, the monarchy, and more are actually institutions that we do believe in, we do have trust in, despite the claims of recent years. Now, turn over to the States, and there is a different story. It seems to me that in the States, very sadly, the single prism through which many people wish to view everything is able to be done even in this crisis. There's an obvious reason for that, which is that Donald Trump is up for re-election later this year. But it has struck me that whereas in Britain, for instance, the people who would wish to use the coronavirus to continue fighting the Brexit wars are way, way to the fringes and have no impact at all. In America, the media and others, most of the media, I should stress, are intent on using this as a means to demonstrate the appallingness of President Trump and the fact that that he shouldn't be re-elected. And I think that there is this deep, deep problem here in America, that the fact that even in a crisis like this, a health crisis of this magnitude, America cannot unite in the way that a country like Britain can, is a very, very worrying thing for American society. And it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on that. I think it should just be noted that at a time of crisis, America does not any longer have reservoirs to draw on that unite the nation.
That is certainly true, I think. We might look back into the past, by the way, and say something similar at the end of the First World War in the 20s. Then, of course, somehow or other, the nation pulled together under the impact of the Depression. And so a united America entered the war in 1941. But yeah, you're quite right, and we might go back to look at that. But I just want to look at another case similar to the United States, and here the discontent or the criticism is international more than it is domestic, though there is some domestic criticism, and that's about the Orban government in Hungary imposing a state of emergency. Previously, 4 years ago, it had come under the same kind of attack and criticism over immigration. That has now faded because most of the European countries have actually adopted the restoration of borders that the Hungarian government suggested. So what's your analysis of why the Hungarians have come under this kind of really strong attack over emergency powers?
I mean, you know far more about this, John, than I do, certainly on the specifics. First of all, I would be highly surprised if this was, as many of the newspapers internationally are saying, something like the end of democracy in Hungary. It's most unlikely, and I'm not particularly sanguine about this. I simply think that it is something I expected to be claimed about certain countries at this time. Let me give the other example. One of the other international bogeyman countries is Israel, and I just wasn't at all surprised that certain international media organizations chose to portray Hungary and Israel as the two countries that had turned authoritarian at this time. Simply because there seems to me to be a particular hit list of countries. Let me give you an example, by the way. I don't think any country in Europe has a figure who constitutionally has more power than the French president. As it happens, Emmanuel Macron is also, by the old definition of the term, the best placed person in Europe to be described in the proper sense of the term, as I used to understand it, to be populist. That is, a populist was said to be somebody who united power solely around themselves. The movements relying on, the dynamism of a single individual that would die without them. Well, this is Emmanuel Macron's move to power, without a doubt. And the French president continues to have powers which are not exercised or able to be accrued by almost any other leader in Europe. But when he exercises them, when, for instance, only a couple of years ago, I mean, all demonstrations, public demonstrations, were banned in France. People did not say that France has become a non-democracy or is an authoritarian country. So I simply think, there are criticisms to be made of the Hungarian government, as of every other government. But I think that there is, as I say, a sort of almost like a hit list of countries, which Hungary and Israel, I feel, are internationally at the top of, where no action is interpreted in a fair light, or even in a light of particularly wanting to understand them. And I saw that firsthand with the immigration issue in 2015. And that makes me very skeptical of the claims that have been made, although, as I say, you know better about the details than I do.
Well, I know one thing, which is about the French president's use of states of emergency. There have been more than 1,000 states of emergency declared by French presidents since 1958 and the establishment of the French Republic. One of my colleagues at the Danube Institute did some research on this. And the interesting thing is that the man who's used them most is not actually Emmanuel Macron. It's his predecessor, the socialist president, and Macron has used them, I think, something like 200, a great many times. So in 2 years. So I mean, I think we can agree entirely on that. Let me just hazard one guess here. My own view is that it is the fact that Hungary and Israel are both examples, but also missionaries for the idea of the rights of independent states and nation states to defend themselves. And a lot of people would really like to smooth away a lot of disputes and put them under the charge of others, like the International Criminal Court. And so anyone who resists that is, whenever they do something which is open to criticism, that criticism is going to be very solid and thorough and aggressive and sometimes completely unfair, precisely because they are resisting the slow onward march of a kind of transnational oligarchy.
That's right, and I mean, I would very happily offer a bet to Christiane Amanpour or any other journalists internationally who are claiming that this is the end of democracy in Hungary. I'd be very happily place a bet that there will be elections in Hungary again.
Well, actually, two bets have already been placed here. One by the Die Welt correspondent Boris Kalnoky and another by Frank Furedi, in which I think Boris says he'll give a bottle of beer to anyone who bets that against him. He says that they both say that within days of the British and French governments ending the state of emergency, the Hungarian government will do the same. Boris offers a modest bottle of beer, but Frank's bet is a serious one. He says if he loses the bet, he'll pay out £100. He'll pay out £50. The other guy has got to pay out 100. No, sorry, the other way around. So that's a serious bet, and if if Anne and others and you maybe feel that you want to make a bit of money, maybe that's a good bet to take. The odds are excellent. Now let me get on to a slightly different point. I want to discuss the way in which the coronavirus, this pandemic, this extraordinary pandemic, is going to change things. I'm going to ask you, because everybody feels that the world has suffered a shock of a really profound kind. Now, I'm going to mention three things, or four rather. One is migration. How will it change our view of migration?
As I say, I'm very wary about predictions, and one reason is because I believe that things can go in absolutely any direction. Let me give you an example on migration. It's possible. I think it's unlikely, but it's possible that after this there is a massive campaign. There's already been an attempt with some videos and other sort of propaganda media in recent days to claim that we only got through the coronavirus in Britain because of immigrants working in the National Health Service, and that therefore we actually as a country owe our lives to immigration, and therefore to have any kind of limiting immigration policy is among other things, not just racist, as it was already claimed to be, not just ugly and nativist, as it was already claimed to be, but against the National Health Service in some way. And indeed that to make any criticisms of migration is basically to be on the side of the coronavirus. That I think that argument will be being made. I don't know whether it will be taken very seriously or how widely it will be felt. But really, it's not about that. It's about the extent to which these claims sink in. In the same way that we know that nations' views of themselves take quite a while to sink in. How a country can start to feel that it is a force for ill in the world, for instance, sinks in quite slowly, but with subtle but important moments that drive that. So with migration, I could easily see how it could go that way. And there's a particular reason for that as well, isn't there? Which is that it might be regarded, in fact, it would be regarded as being exceptionally poor form to point out the number of people of immigrant background who are using the National Health Service at the moment. I would regard, as a critic of mass migration, I would regard people doing that at this moment as engaging in a very ugly form of politicking at a moment which should be above that. But as I say, those manners are not being reciprocated on the other side of the argument. So maybe there will be an advantage for those people. Another thought about this, though, is that there could be, at a very deep level, some resistance of a kind that we couldn't have foreseen other than with a crisis like this. Some kind of deep resistance to one thing that happens with globalization, which is the ability to move around with great ease. I don't know that this is going to change immediately. I'd be very surprised if it changed immediately. I'd be very surprised if after the lockdown ended, people were reluctant to go abroad. I think, if anything, there's going to be an upsurge if we have any money to travel after this. But in the long run, there is now very visibly a negative to this particular aspect of globalization. We cannot predict which of these sorts of instincts is going to embed itself more deeply in the general public. But as I say, all of these things can go in absolutely any direction. But I'd be surprised if people weren't now aware that there are downsides to things that have been perceived as being solely virtues.
One of those might be free trade. For example, supply chains have been taken really for a wholly good improvement in our lives, because they meant that we could get the cheapest possible goods in the most efficient manner, just in time, as the phrase was. Now, if we're going to look at what's happened in this, are businesses now going to say, we don't want to rely too much for the supply of important goods on countries which may not be that friendly, particularly, obviously, in this context, China?
Yes. Again, I mean, here is something that could be dug in at quite a deep level after this. Let me give an example. Somebody saying, buy British, for instance, until only a couple of months ago, it wasn't an uncommon thing to hear. Some products even say it. But it wasn't a very attractive thing to say. It looked like the sort of thing, again, a sort of slightly petty nativist might say, I don't want to buy any of that foreign muck, sort of. That would be how such a person would be portrayed. Now, of course, there is great sense in this argument. And after this stress test of our globalized world, maybe these things will become more possible to say. Maybe it will become possible to say, and make it more acceptable to say, look, yes, it's true in recent years we've been able to buy products cheaper because we've outsourced a lot of work to workers in China and elsewhere. But it turns out there is a price to pay down the road, and we've just seen when and where we pay that. I think that is more likely after this. I think that there will be an opportunity for arguments to be made which were, if not unacceptable, then slightly unpalatable in recent years. Their palatability is just returning.
That leads me to the question about the topic of your current book. What what about the culture wars? Are they going to change? Because after all, we've just had an enormous shock, which is going to make some of the things we're obsessing about seem really second-hand questions. And also, it's going to create a feeling, I think, that we want to come together. And maybe I'm wrong on that score, but that's one response, which, as you said, has happened in England, but has obviously not happened in America.
Yes. Again, one has to be so careful with predictions because there's always a tendency to predict according to what would most suit you and most fit your own desired outcomes. So when this started, I did have an inkling of thinking, well, maybe that will at least see off the woke people. However, people double down. There have been attempts in recent days and weeks to say, for instance, that women suffer more from the coronavirus than men. And then when it's pointed out that actually the virus kills men in larger quantities than it does women, the same people say, well, men may die in larger numbers, but it's the women who suffer for that. And so there are people who have been harping on repeatedly about the claim that ethnic minorities disproportionately are dying. By the way, they don't look at why that might be. For instance, in London, where I think it's some people claim the lowest estimate is that about 40% of the population of London is of a minority ethnic population. That, of course, if the centre of your virus is in London, that's the most densely populated part of the country as well. And if that portion of the country has a larger minority ethnic population, then there is likely to be a disproportionate outbreak among those people. That isn't the light in which it's presented. It is presented very sinisterly, as if minority ethnic people are suffering from the coronavirus in this slight disproportion, if this is indeed the case, because of racism in society or something like this. So there are people trying that. And I have to say, I think it's odious to see that. But this is the lens through which they have been looking at the world for years. And a massive global pandemic isn't going to shift them, and it will persuade some of them indeed to double down. I do, however, think that broadly speaking, there will be a diminishment of the wider public appetite to listen to this sort of argument. As I said last week in the Spectator, when a real grievance comes along, when a real problem comes along, we don't have much time for people with imaginary problems. When everybody is suffering what is going to be, as we know, a massive hit to our wealth, our incomes, a massive increase in unemployment in our societies, we might want to hear less from multi-millionaire pop stars talking about the horror of being non-binary and the horror of a lack of understanding of something that isn't real anyway. But anyhow, yes, so I do think there might be a diminishment in the public appetite to listen to this sort of thing, because we have been, and I did actually say this in The Madness of Crowds, all of those identity politics complaints are the product of prosperity. They are the product of societies that are very free. They are the product of societies that are very much more equal than others, and that's why people can grouse and cavil about all of this. But yes, I would expect a diminuendo in the tolerance of the argument, but possibly a doubling down of the argument itself.
As a matter of fact, I think one particular case is interesting. When we're all going to be a great deal poorer, as I think, and most other people believe to be the case, it's going to be quite hard to persuade people to embark on the more utopian versions of climate change policy, which actually do say we have to accept a cut in our standard of living. When you've already got a cut, it's very hard to persuade people to take a second one.
And by the way, also it's very interesting. I think that the sort of Extinction Rebellion people will find less of an audience than they perhaps are already acquiring, because we've just had a taste, or we are having a taste of what life is like under their proposed, lockdown. And I was interested in the early days of the corona crisis by the fact that the extremes of the Green movement were trying to use it. There were lots of things saying things like, now the humans have retreated, the wildlife is returning, the earth is breathing again. A friend sent me a photograph or a spoof that was going around online photograph of a beautiful site in the Maldives, and it said the humans are retreating, the earth is breathing again. This was Slough this morning. And international viewers may not know, but Slough is one of our less attractive cities. Anyhow, there is this. I think that the claims of the green extremists also are going to look rather ugly and unpalatable, but not before time.
No, we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask you two more questions. One is really about Boris. You've already talked about him briefly, but I've noticed that even before the coronavirus struck, that his popularity, and surprisingly, to a great extent, the Tory parties as well, had greatly improved. The Tory party exactly 1 year ago got 8% in the European elections. It recently got something like almost 48%, and if you added the Brexit party's 2%, they were almost up to 50%. Now, Boris, since the coronavirus struck, already enjoying this popularity, he has had this extraordinary experience of being rushed to hospital, released, given this very impressive and emotional talk about the National Health Service and thanking doctors. And his popularity has now soared, it seems to me, while he's convalescing, to enormous heights. I wonder if this is a change, a really major change in British politics, or is it something likely to fade?
I think it is a major change. The main argument that the left has had in Britain, it's been wheeling out, as you know, for decades, is that every election you should vote Labour because it's our last chance to save the NHS. Even when the Tories, the Conservatives, increase spending to the NHS, the Labour Party goes into the next election saying it's our last chance to save the NHS because the Tories will privatise it or shut it down or that they have. I mean, by the way, I mean the extremism of the arguments that come from the left about this. You know, the claim, and it happened at the beginning of this, the Conservative Party actually wants to kill the electorate. I mean, for instance, I mean, you don't go to the fringes to find these people. These are in the mainstream in the left. These sorts of views. I think it's going to be very much harder, even than it has been, for the left to persuade the country that the Tory party is opposed to the NHS. You know, from the beginning of this crisis, the Conservatives have put the NHS front and centre. It is the reason why the public have been persuaded to stay in their homes, because we were persuaded that whatever the eventual death toll, that there was a possibility of an overwhelming of the NHS in the early stages of this crisis. And we believed the government for that. I think there's something very important to say here about the difference between the shallowness of the daily political discourse and the deep wells that certain politicians can pull on and draw upon. Boris Johnson has always had his flaws, particularly in the last few years since leading the Brexit campaign, has always had his flaws put front and centre by the media. And it always ignored the fact that he has always been an enormously likable figure. He is, as I've written somewhere before, the only politician in my adult lifetime who, when you mentioned his name to people, people smiled. Nobody ever said, Philip Hammond. Nobody ever smiled and said, Theresa May. But they did say, admittedly, this took a blow at the time of the Brexit vote among anti-Brexit voters who were annoyed with Boris for leading us out. But admittedly, this took a blow at that point. But broadly speaking, there is a fondness for him. Of course, he has detractors, as everybody does. But in this crisis, it turned out that he has been able to draw very deep into the British public's reserves, as the Queen has. And this, I think we should be enormously grateful for this. Were we led by Jeremy Corbyn at the moment, I don't think it would have been as straightforward to unite the British people. I think there would have been much more of the craziness. And I think those things that have happened, I mean, there have been tiny outbursts of almost historical irrationality, people attacking 5G masts, for instance, under the erroneous impression that 5G causes coronavirus. These sorts of slightly weird conspiracy things are right to the margins on this. And I don't think that would have been the case had we not had a prime minister who could bring the public along with him and persuade us that the situation could have been an awful lot worse if we hadn't have acted as we have.
Douglas, you've written 5 books, and we've been discussing those books, but also the way in which the arguments in them apply to our current conditions and may apply to future conditions. My question, therefore, is, where are you going to go next? What's your next set of interests? And I ask that question with a subtext, which is, you're one of the few public intellectuals who takes religion seriously. Maybe more of them are beginning to emerge as well. And I wonder what where religion will be playing. What part will it be playing in your future work and thinking?
I'm fortunate as a writer to have a backlog of books in my head and trying to work out which order to do them in. Fortunately, being a writer, I already have quite a lot of time to myself. I've had rather more time to myself in recent weeks, as we all have. And I've been thinking, as I always do, about what to do next. I never talk about projects before I've finished them. Yes, religion is much on my mind and has been much on my mind throughout this crisis. I think that partly because at times where the kaleidoscope is completely shaken, it's very important to think about those things which remain eternal, consistent, and the human desires and urges that remain consistent, including the urge for the divine, the urge also for meaning. I think that an awful lot of people will have been thinking about around these issues. I have got a book which I'm just starting work on, but I'm also trying to make sure that I write more often about cultural issues than I have done in recent years in a positive light. I've done a lot of shooting down, if I say so myself, of bad ideas. But of course, the important thing is also to say, here are the good ideas, and here are the, as well as here are all of the bad books. Isn't enough. I do enjoy when I have the opportunity in essays elsewhere to point people to the good books, to good music, to great music, to great thought and literature, to the great civilizational inheritance that we all have, which is available to anyone of any background, any economic circumstance. And that, it seems to me, is something that I do want to concentrate on more. I'm deeply struck that whatever happens in the era we're going into, the greatest things we have in life are all effectively free. And they are there for anyone who reaches out and wishes to partake in them. And that at a time when one might well be depressed about all sorts of things, that is a reason for enormous optimism, both personally and civilizationally.
That's a very good note on which to end, Douglas. Thank you very much indeed. We've greatly enjoyed having you as our guest.
It's an enormous pleasure. Thank you.